to find that they were at these points where these nerves were penetrating the body fascia and where there was superficial plexus of nerves that was deep to that structure, so that in fact that confirmed what they were speculating as these were taking place. We also see four main types of acupuncture points. There are type 1. Those are by far and large the most common. Those are motor points. That's about 70% of all the points. And it's really where the nerve enters into a muscle, where if you stimulate that point, it causes a maximal contraction with the minimum stimulation, because you're hitting right at the nerve, right at the muscle, so that it goes right to the muscle to create its effect. And it's really where that nerve enters. A great example of that is large intestine 4, which in us, if we put our thumb in the webbing between our first finger and our thumb and push, it's halfway around the metacarpal. It's a sensitive point. It's a master point for head and neck. So Hugu is really a very powerful point used commonly for treating lots of different conditions. That's one example of that. That's where that nerve penetrates that muscle. Type 2 points are points that are on the dorsal and ventral midline. So they represent the governing vessel and conception vessel points. They are on the sagittal planes. There are lots of different points that are there. Byway is one of those at the LS junction. In humans, byway is GV20 at the top of the head. Governing vessel 20, governing vessel 26, conception vessel 22, 17, 12, 6, all of those are on that, and that represents the ones that we see for type 2. Type 3 are where superficial nerves and there are nerve plexes, and so they're wherever nerves are dividing in the body. A good example of that would be gallbladder 34. That's part of the common peroneal nerve, deep to that deep and superficial branch where they're dividing. Another is, of course, pericardium 6, which in us is two Schwinn above the crease between the two tendons. That's that point that's the most studied one on the planet because it's used for nausea, for motion sickness, for pregnancy, all kinds of things. A lot of people have studied that. Certainly been studied tremendously in helping prevent nausea from cancer and particularly chemotherapy. So those are good examples of those points. The key is those are points following where the nerve is dividing. We also have type 4 points, which are muscle tendon junction points. They're kind of where the Golgi tendon is. Bladder 57 is an example of that. Kidney 7, another example. Triple heater 10 at the elbow, another example. And that's where the nerve which inhibits, it's for the inverse myotatic reflex. It's so that if the muscle contracts too hard, rather than to rip the tendon from its insertion, the Golgi activates to relax the muscle to calm it down. And so by stimulating these points, we can relax regionally areas that would be under tension otherwise, and so they can be very effective at treating muscle spasms and pain. So those are the four main types of points that we see. There are also hemoacupuncture points that are associated with vessels, and so these, the plexus is actually in the vessel wall, and if we stick a needle that is hollow in those vessels, we can actually let blood flow, and we see that can take place. If you're doing that for like the ting point of the hoof of the horse or one of the other points that's used as hemoacupuncture in the hoof, a lot of times you start out, there's stagnation, the blood tends to be really dark and thick, and as the blood flows, it brightens up and becomes much more oxygenated, helping to relieve the stagnation and getting more blood flow back to the region. And so those points can be used to help exchange sort of the blood in that area to get blood flow going again. If you put a dry needle in, it still causes some regulation of that blood flow, but it's just not quite as potent as actually using a hollow needle. So there's two different ways. When Dr. Shea first came here in China, you put in a needle in a horse and you'd let a gallon of blood out. They have about 9 gallons, so a gallon isn't very much, but it looks like a lot when you put it on the floor. And people here would be a little bit freaked out about that. So we've begun to realize that maybe we can be a little less aggressive, but letting it go until it brightens up makes a big difference. And so it can actually improve regional blood flow and help with healing. Meridians are another thing of acupuncture. They are closely related to the peripheral nervous system, so the acupuncture meridian and the peripheral nervous pathways are fairly closely associated. It's a little bit different when we talk about like the bladder meridian, because the bladder meridian has multiple nerves that are involved, and it's not sure whether there's an interconnection between them, like, you know, they're the telephone poles and the nerves spread out so that there's enough of an interconnection that it spreads down the wires of the telephone poles so that segments get interconnected, or whether it goes into the spinal cord and zips around in there and connects that way. Either way, there is some sort of at least electrical connection with them because we can see impacts that take place when we stimulate them. Some of the others, it's a lot easier because like the lung meridian follows the musculocutaneous nerve, the pericardial meridian follows the median nerve. So we have lots of different nerves that we can actually associate it with very specific nerves peripherally. So in many ways, the Chinese mapped the peripheral nervous system by finding access points along the nerve highways where you could access that nerve to have impacts on the nervous system, and that's really how meridians tend to work. They process a bioelectrical function very similar to the nervous system. It's just that the sensation along the meridian might have a little bit slower activation. There is a lot of research on meridians, and there's some new research that's been coming out that's been a little bit more suggestive of finding connections between them. But if we do stimulate an acupuncture point at one site, we can see that the other acupuncture points on that meridian actually will change in their electrical resistance, so that there seems to be some kind of a electrical connection between those points. Of course, if these are nerves, that makes perfect sense. We don't see that on other meridians, so that the ones that are not associated with it, points that are not associated with it, don't seem to have that change. You can also put a radio transmitter on one point, and then you can pick it up with a receiver along acupuncture points along that meridian, but not on the other meridian. So there is, a connection that transmits, information along it. We can also inject radioisotope into the point, and if we stimulate that point over time, we can actually see that isotope progress along, heading toward the other acupuncture points on that meridian. So that suggests that not only is there an electrical connection, there is also some form of structural connection where these things actually do have a pathway where the points are interconnected. There's speculation that it may be the endolymph that's around the nerve that acts a little bit like a lymphatic flow system, so that as you're stimulating the nerve, not only do you have the electrical conduction, but you also have a physical connection with this space that's around the nerve that actually connects point to point by some sort of physical characteristic. So when we look at the meridians, there are those 14 major meridians, the lung paired to the large intestine, the heart paired to the small intestine, pericardium paired to the triple heater. Those are the ones that are in the chest. So if you're above the diaphragm, yin and yang are going to be going to front leg and to face. If you're below the diaphragm, the spleen, liver, and kidney paired with stomach, gallbladder, and bladder, then those are going to start on the feet and go to the back to the chest for the yin, and yang from the face down to the feet. So that's one way in which we can sort of separate them, is those above the diaphragm and those below. And in conjunction with those that are heading out to the hands and up to the face and down to the feet and back to the chest, there is also sort of an internal meridian from the mouth that goes through the center core of the body and leaves, and then the energy travels back on the midlines above and below in the governing vessel on the dorsal surface and the conception vessel on the ventral or forward surface, back to end in the mouth to recirculate the energy through the core and back around the body, through the core and back around the body. And these mapping of energies through that are fairly consistent. Those who are involved in energy medicine and actually just feel bodies can feel ebb and flow of energy traveling in the body in 3 to 6 minute cycles, and that's really what's happening all the time. But during the time of the day by Chinese clock, the energy tends to be a little more concentrated in the meridian that's there. They are an energy flow system. They flow qi. Qi is one version of qi is the energy that flows in channels. It flows from point to point to point in these major meridians where the acupuncture points are going to live. And it is a normally flowing system that flows all the time from one point to the next. And so, it goes back to that Chinese clock: lung, large intestine, stomach, spleen. We get up in the morning, take a big breath. Then it's time to take a poo. Now we've got the poo out so we can eat something. And then we need to digest that. And then things go on. So you've heard that story again and again, and that's the flow at which it occurs. Well, with meridians, from our perspective, if there is no flow, we usually stop the flow of energy. That leads to pain, and that causes obstruction of the qi in the meridian and painful response. What we do with acupuncture is to eliminate that pathogen, and by eliminating the pathogen, we reestablish the flow on the meridian where it's normal. So when the meridian's blocked, there's pain. When the meridian is flowing normally, there is no pain. Okay? We also have reflex connections and central nervous system connections to the reflexes, which we're going to talk about somewhat together. If we stick a needle into the spinal column, we get these local effects, we get these spinal effects, and then we get brainstem effects. They are sequential, but they're also very quick to happen at the same time, and they all there. Those are involved in stimulating the nociceptor fibers, the A deltas, and also the C fibers that lead to these local, segmental, and brainstem effects that we've recorded. Acupuncture seems to be carried by peripheral nerves in a sense because we can block its propagation by procaine. So if I do a nerve block and I stimulate below that, I will get no analgesia to that paralyzed limb below that mark. Or if I have an animal with posterior paralysis, I will not have acupunctural analgesia added to where they're already sensory. What you do get is the local effect, and if the segment's intact, segmental effect, but it never gets to the brain to cause a systemic effect. That's why we often stimulate above and below the lesion so that we can activate all of those mechanisms. So the most profound analgesia that we see is over the major peripheral nerves when they are intact and functioning, and that's when it is most effective. So the nervous system and acupuncture are intimately related, and it's really why neurologists get involved in acupuncture, because it's a way to stimulate the nervous system to actually help it heal. That pathway or nerve, of course, enters the spinal cord, and that's the first place where we see some integration of the activation. It then will travel up the spinal cord based upon what happens at the segmental level, up into the thalamus and eventually to the cerebral cortex. So if a bee stings you on your hand, first thing is there's, of course, a little local redness. The next thing is you have this idea, something stung me, and because of the spatial relationship, your brain can say, it stung me here. And that's kind of how that system works. Well, if I stimulate that point to modify the sensation there, then I'm actually working through mechanisms to alter my perception sometimes of pain and actually reduce the pain itself. So there are these central connections that play an important role. It kind of gets down to the gate theory of pain. The gate theory of pain is partly that A delta and C fibers are lightly myelinated, smaller fibers, so their conduction's relatively slow. Proprioceptive fibers, which are muscle stretch, movement, kinesthesis, ideas of shape fibers, move very fast. So if that bee stings me and I rub it, I'm stimulating the pathways that get there before the pain signal, and I can close the gate. so that the pain information is blocked and never really gets to be transmitted further. We'll talk about that later in a further lecture, but it is part of the key concept. So stimulating those other pathways can actually shut that down, and that's part of what acupuncture does. It can stimulate those faster conducting fibers and help to close the gate. In addition to that, it will change what's taking place up at the brainstem because it alters the information that gets there as well. But if I rub and I quit rubbing, it hurts again. So I have to keep rubbing until it doesn't hurt. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish with acupuncture. Okay? So we can look at acupuncture and we can study it. They've done a lot of that in mice and rats. Again, it's measurable, so that's something where placebo and blindedness isn't as important. You can look at responses to heat, electricity, pinprick, pinch, all these different things to kind of get a degree of their response to that to see if they have analgesia or not. And so there's a pain threshold that we see in animals, and if we do acupuncture, we can raise the pain threshold which causes analgesia. But if we use naloxone to block the acupuncture, then the pain threshold is not raised and the analgesia is missing. And so that was some of the original studies that were taking place and looking at these things to find out. And so we found that if we electrically stimulated an acupuncture point, at lower levels, we could gradually increase the pain threshold and it would gradually decrease back to normal. If we increase the frequency, we get a rise. It's a little faster. It stays up a little bit longer. We use a higher frequency. It comes up even faster, stays a little bit longer. And so we can actually create a dose-dependent response based upon the acupuncture that we do and see. However, there's a little more to it than that, because if we look at low-level stimulus and we use naloxone, naloxone can blunt or block the analgesic effect of the acupuncture. So it doesn't raise the pain threshold and therefore do that. Where if we use saline, we get that curve just like before, but if we actually use naloxone, we can block that. So low-level stimulation is blocked by naloxone, which means that it's related to endorphins and enkephalins, which are the endogenous opioids which affect the receptors, the endorphins from the brainstem, the enkephalins from the segmental areas to regulate pain thresholds. Those are the mu and kappa receptors for morphine, and those are blocked and or displaced by naloxone. So there is a competitive effect associated with those. However, if we use higher frequency, we see that naloxone doesn't block that, because that either is involving serotonin at the highest levels, which actually is an analgesic, but not as effective as the opioids, but still a very good analgesic. There's a systemic component, and also the dynorphins, which are for segmental analgesia and involve the gamma receptor for the morphine, which is not displaced by naloxone. So some of the original studies, there was question about whether acupuncture worked or didn't work, because some found that it would be displaced with naloxone, some found it wasn't, and that really had to do with the differences in the frequencies that were being used to stimulate. But what we found is that there are different mediators and different parts of this nervous system in the substantia gelatinosa, the spinal cord, where that first level of integration takes place. The two important hormones that are involved in that are the enkephalins and dynorphins at the spinal level. Again, this is for the kappa and this is for the gamma receptor, so that's the ones that worked. This is naloxone sensitive and this is naloxone insensitive. On the endorphins, we have the brainstem and the periaqueductal gray, which cause the systemic change. Those are the mu receptors, and again, those are naloxone sensitive. We also have in the raphe nuclei in the brainstem serotonin, which is released, causing an analgesia. Also, it descends and regulates the gait, so it has a descending process to actually inhibit pain coming in to begin with. That is related to serotonin and other hormones that descend. And essentially, that's a neurotransmitter that can be used for pain control. And of course, it is not blocked by naloxone. We also have differences in species. So if we look at animals in general, and we kind of look at their overall pain threshold and adjust it based upon the species, what we can see is that horses like acupuncture. It does a pretty good job of helping to regulate their problems, and they respond to acupuncture, and we see benefits associated with that. Mules, on the other hand, are kind of stubborn, and they don't seem to respond to anything. They get a little bit of a response, but it's just not nearly as good as we see in horses. And cows love acupuncture. Let's face it, they can't be, weird animals. They got to be aliens. They've got too much brain with all those gyri and sulci, and all they do is eat grass. Gary Larson might have it right. They're smoking cigarettes and sitting around talking, and they go, "Oop, car!" So they duck down. So the key is that cows really like acupuncture. So we see some species variation. Now, some of that is we can breed outcross mice that are insensitive to acupuncture, and they actually have a hormone in their brain, cholecystokinin, that blocks acupuncture. We'll talk about that more in another lecture. But we can block that effect by giving them aspartame, which is phenylalanine. Phenylalanine blocks that and makes them more responsive. So that's something that we can use. We also know that it varies a little bit from acupuncture point, and we also know that it varies from the proximity of the acupuncture point. So that's really what I want to say this time, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about some of the functional characteristics of that next lecture.